Even if my own father were an heretic, I would personally gather the wood with which to have him burned. Paul IV, Pope and Inquisitor. For 450 years, secrets and terror were an integral part of the Roman Inquisition. It still exists to this very day. We are the first film team in the world to go through the files of the Inquisition in order to seek the truth behind the dark legend.
Schaut, Eminenz. Solch eine Konjunktur der Venus seht ihr erst in 100 Jahren wieder.
Nun denn, Meister Galilei, in 100 Jahren mag ich eben da im Himmel sein. Vor Jahren saß ich am Strand von Capua. Ich wollte die Macht des Schöpfers begreifen, indem ich die Geschwindigkeit berechnete, mit der die Sonne um die Erde kreist. Ich wählte die Spanne von dem mystischen Moment, da die Sonne das Meer berührt, bis zu dem Zeitpunkt, da sie vollständig im Meer versunken ist.
Ihr müsst einen über die Maßen teuren Chronometer besitzen.
Ich tat das, worin ich ein weniges an Übung habe. Ich betete. Die Dauer des Sonnenuntergangs betrug genau 2 Ave Maria.
Ihr wisst doch, dass manche der neuen Astronomen meinen, dass in Wahrheit die Sonne Mittelpunkt des Alls ist. Und dass die Erde um die Sonne kreist.
Ich hörte, die Theorie sei denkbar, jedoch unbewiesen.
Ich will euch nicht mit Mathematik langweilen, aber wäre es nicht auch ganz im Sinne unseres Glaubens, die Sonne, den Quell von Licht und Wärme, im Mittelpunkt unserer Welt zu sehen?
Mein lieber Galilei, langweilt mich meinethalben. Aber haltet eure Mathematik von unserem einzig christlichen Glauben fern.
Ich sage euch eins. Kopernikus gehört die Zukunft.
Vielleicht. Aber der Weg in die Zukunft wird immer noch bewacht von der heiligen, römischen und universalen Inquisition. Nehmt euch in Acht. Wo Licht ist, ist auch die Dunkelheit.
Even for someone like Galileo Galilei, it is a rare honor to pay a visit to the Honorable Cardinal Inquisitor, Robert Bellarmine. This holds true in spite of the fact that the astronomer and physicist Galileo is one of the most famous scientists of his day. But Bellarmine is the eminence grise of the Holy Office, the feared Roman Inquisition. Bellarmine is the greatest Catholic theologian of his time. Even his opponents secretly admire his polemic writings. After the upheavals of the Reformation, the papacy has regained its former power, thanks to the fact that intellectuals such as Bellarmine are in positions of influence. Europe is divided by a fault line between opposing Catholic and Protestant countries. Up to now, the religions have waged their battle with ideas, not weapons. The Palace of the Holy Office in Rome is the headquarters of the Counter-Reformation and Catholic renewal. To this day, it houses the secret archives of the Roman Inquisition. These archives reveal how inquisitors at the time assessed each new doctrine with a view to its compatibility with the Catholic faith. They passed judgment on orthodoxy and heresy, canonization and damnation, life and death. Peter Godman from New Zealand is one of the first researchers to be granted access to these archives.
The traditional image of the church against thinkers fails to take account of the huge number of thinkers in the Inquisition and the Index who worked as censors but who also wrote books. The same people who were putting the works of unorthodox thinkers on the Index were composing a Catholic alternative, if you like, a kind of Catholic counterculture to what was being offered by the Protestants.
At their first meeting, Galileo and Bellarmine had encountered each other as scholars. A few years later, Robert Bellarmine meets Galileo again, this time in his role as inquisitor. Galileo, the astronomer, has been denounced. It is an unusual case. The Inquisition has never dealt with natural sciences before.
All scientific theories pursued in the 16th century can basically be described as either astrology or white magic. The author's intentions were what was punished, not so much the content itself. White magic is concerned with invoking spirits and demons, which obviously has no scientific background in the modern sense. The first truly scientific theory to collide with conventional dogma was the heliocentric worldview.
Cosa che non ha un significato scientifico nel senso attuale, evidentemente. In un certo senso, la prima teoria scientifica in senso proprio che collide con la dottrina religiosa tradizionale è l'eliocentrismo.
At the time, the prevailing interpretation of the Bible held that the earth stands still and is the center of the universe. The astronomer Nicolaus Copernicus, however, maintains that the sun is the center of the universe and is circled by the earth. As a mathematical theory, this heliocentric model of the world does not give any offense, and even aids the Pope in calculating the new Gregorian calendar. But Galileo turns what had been a theory into an immutable truth.
Non va dimenticato che l'opera di Copernico era stata pubblicata nel 1543.
The book by Copernicus was published as early as 1543. We have evidence that it was reported to the Inquisition several times in the 16th century. Yet the Inquisition did not intervene until Galileo's dissemination of these teachings made it impossible to ignore their potential to destroy the conventional worldview.
Galileo touches on what had been age-old certitudes. This is not just about the sun and the earth. It's about science's claim to compete with the Bible. It is about the nature of human existence, for it calls into question the position of human beings as the pinnacle of creation at the center of the world.
The significance of human beings changed. No longer at the center, they became peripheral beings at the mercy of the cosmos. People need to digest that, and perhaps still haven't even now. In this light, it is understandable that people struggle with the question of what is really out there.
Cardinal Ratzinger is the prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, the successor organization to the Inquisition. His office is similar to the one Cardinal Bellarmine once held.
You
have to see the historic context. Galileo's proof was not conclusive then, and Bellarmine decided, rightly so in my opinion, that it's just an hypothesis. In light of that, we have to judge the attempt to hold on to what was considered the legacy of centuries more mildly than from the vantage point of what we know today.
Bellarmine cannot allow Galileo and his theories to do what is the job of theology. But a trial would damage the Church's reputation. Bellarmine resorts to a ruse. He prohibits the idea that the Earth revolves around the Sun for being heretical. However, the files reveal that this ban was not supposed to be in effect for all time, and could conceivably be lifted. Galileo, the actual accused, is not mentioned at all. In a private audience, Bellarmine warns Galileo not to publicly teach the theories of Copernicus, but allows him to continue his research. In handling the matter so shrewdly, Bellarmine is unique in the annals of the Inquisition.
I've found quite a large number of unknown writings by him, and what they demonstrate is how a man of serious purpose and very high intelligence was frequently frustrated by the limitations of the organizations for which he worked.
Under Cardinal Bellarmine, the Inquisition acquires a humane face. When he dies in 1621, the Pope and the cardinals attend his wake. People gather in the streets, tearing at their clothes. Experts examine the body for signs of the supernatural. For them, Bellarmine is a holy man. But his wisdom would not survive after his death. The long smouldering hatred between Catholics and Protestants has erupted in a war which will later be called the 30 Years' War. The peoples of Europe confront each other on German soil, and in the most lethal conflict the world has known up to then, leave millions of dead in their wake, as well as a continent that is devastated both materially and spiritually. In Rome, the war seems far away. The profligate Pope Urban VIII leaves his flock in the lurch. His only aim is to further the glory of his family. The Pope wants to bask in the light of Galileo's reputation. Pretending to be Galileo's friend, the Pope encourages him to write a treatise comparing the different models of the world presented by the Church and by astronomy. The Pope would himself provide the arguments for the model, proposing that the Earth is at the center of the universe. And indeed, Galileo does use the Pope's arguments, but he creates a dialogue which puts the Pope's words into the mouth of an idiot. In addition, Galileo defends the teachings of Copernicus as proven beyond a doubt. The Pope is highly offended and makes Galileo appear before the tribunal of the Inquisition. The frail old man is accused of relapsing into heresy and is even threatened with torture. Galileo submits, and not just out of fear. He is a deeply devout Christian and wants to avoid a falling out with the Church.
Mit aufrichtigem Herzen und ungeheucheltem Glauben schwöre ich, meinen Irrtümern und Ketzereien und allgemein jedem Irrtum und jeder Ketzerei ab, welche sich gegen Mit aufrichtigem Herzen und ungeheucheltem Glauben schwöre ich, meinen Irrtümern und Ketzereien und allgemein allen anderen Irrtümern und jeder Ketzerei ab, welche der Heiligen Kirche entgegenstehen. Ich verfluche und verabscheue sie und schwöre, dass ich in Zukunft nie wieder etwas sagen oder versichern will, das Anlass zu einem ähnlichen Verdacht wider mich geben kann. Und wenn ich irgendeinen Ketzer oder irgendjemand der Ketzerei Verdächtigen kenne, will ich ihn der Heiligen Inquisition anzeigen. Gott, dieses heilige Evangelium, das ich mit meinen Händen berühre, mögen mir helfen.
Galileo is sentenced to life imprisonment. He is allowed to pass his sentence at his country home, where he continues his research. But he does not live to see his rehabilitation. Decades after his death, the truth of his teachings is proven beyond a doubt. But even then, the Inquisition does not admit to its mistakes. Geniuses such as Galileo propel scientific progress forward rapidly. Europe enters the modern age, but the Church persists in standing still and is left behind. A century after Robert Bellarmine's death, another man struggles to reform the Inquisition.
Nur Gott kann noch helfen.
Ein Wunder!
Je unruhiger die Zeiten, umso mehr hoffen die einfachen Menschen auf ein Wunder. Kaum je zuvor ist die Heilige Römische Kirche durch diesen Wunderglauben so sehr in Anspruch genommen worden. Ich, Prospero Lambertini, muss es wissen, als Erzbischof von Bologna und Inquisitor des Heiligen Offiziums.
Halleluja! Wenn ich es mit eigenen Augen gesehen habe. Es war tot, das Kind. Tot. Ertrunken. Und ist von den Toten auferstanden.
Ihr wollt also ein Verfahren, dass der Heilige Stuhl dieses Wunder anerkennt und seine Hand schützend darüber breitet. Das kann Jahrzehnte, selbst Jahrhunderte dauern.
Davon weiß ich nichts. Es ist ein
Wunder. Mein lieber Monsignore, Wunder sind Zeichen, die uns der Herr nur äußerst selten sendet. Und obzwar sie imposant erscheinen, verletzen sie doch niemals die Gesetze der Natur.
Ich trinke nicht, Eminenz.
Ihr sollt mir auch nicht eure Trinkfestigkeit demonstrieren. Zeigt mir, wie das ertrunkene Kind transportiert worden ist. Auf dem Weg vom Brunnen. Stellt euch vor, diese Karaffe wäre das Kind.
Ich nehme an, so. Der Kopf hing herunter.
Mhm.
Aber was hat das zu bedeuten?
Seht ihr? Durch den Transport konnte das Wasser aus der Lunge des Kindes wieder austreten. Die Leute haben wie gute Mediziner gehandelt. ohne es zu wissen. Auf eine Art ist das ein Wunder.
Prospero Lambertini is the Catholic Church's leading expert on canonization. As a kind of devil's advocate, it is his responsibility to disprove miracles and expose false saints as swindlers. With a detective's pertinacity, he ferrets out the nugget of truth buried in seemingly inexplicable phenomena. He even examines reports on the misdeeds of vampires from faraway Transylvania. With his healthy skepticism, Lambertini is a child of his time. It is an age of awakening, an age that wants to shake off the dust of centuries. The call for civil liberties first sounds in France. Now writers and philosophers all over Europe are dreaming of the end of narrow-minded dictates by the church and the state. And they are dreaming out loud. The Inquisition is still spreading terror. However, those accused of sedition are no longer burned at the stake. Instead, this century of enlightenment produces numerous revolutionary books. The French writer Voltaire, in particular, provokes the enmity of the Inquisition. Such diatribes do not move Prospero Lambertini any more than they had moved his role model, Cardinal Bellarmine. He contradicts the cliché of an inquisitor.
Lambertini was a synthesis of the best elements of the Latin and the Italian spirit. He himself made jokes about French, German and Italian scholars. Of course, he preferred Italians because he thought them more balanced. He himself was certainly an example of a well-balanced temperament and a man of incredible erudition.
Lui certamente è un esempio di questo equilibrio e di questa vasta conoscenza, no?
Archbishop Tarcisio Bertone is secretary of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, an important man in the successor organization of the Roman Inquisition. He has great admiration for his predecessor, Lambertini.
Lo direi un uomo di mondo, ma in senso positivo.
He was a man of the world, in the positive rather than the negative sense. He was, after all, a great man of the cloth. But he was also someone with a flair for public relations, amusing and sophisticated both in manner and in speech. People today still tell jokes that he made up or that describe him. He was a man who could relate to anyone, believers and non-believers alike, and especially to the scientists and intellectuals of his time.
Soprattutto a scienziati, il rapporto con gli intellettuali del suo tempo.
In Lambertini's time, the Roman Church has become a global church. Never before have there been so many believers from all parts of the world. But in reality, the Vatican's seemingly unlimited power is little more than an illusion. The Christian rulers of France, Austria and Spain are pursuing their own absolutist policies. They only subscribe to the Catholic faith because it serves their strategic interests. The Pope is no longer, as he was in the Middle Ages, the father of princes and kings. He is, however, an important mediator at the center of Europe.
We have the situation of peace. It is a precarious peace. in which the Pope has to exercise a very careful diplomacy, mediating in particular between France and Austria. But at the same time, it is a position of a certain strength in that the man who ascends the throne of St. Peter.
It is 1740. A new pope must be elected. Isolated from the outside world, the cardinals struggle to come to a decision. And yet, they're anything but independent. Each of the Catholic empires wants a compliant pope. In the infernal heat of the Roman summer, reconciling the various interests seems impossible.
Irgendwann gab ich es auf, die Wahlgänge zu zählen. Ein Kardinal der Gegenpartei meinte, es seien über 250. Wir waren seit 6 Monaten von der Außenwelt vollständig abgeschnitten und hatten noch immer keinen neuen Papst. Die Hitze und die Streitereien brachten mich und viele andere an den Rand des Todes.
Was spricht gegen Gotti?
Was spricht gegen Aldo Brandini?
Die Kaiserin Maria Theresia.
Die französische Krone.
Und dann gibt es noch die Spanier. Was ist mit euch? Habt ihr einen Vorschlag, um unseren gordischen Knoten zu zerhauen?
Wenn ihr einen Heiligen wünscht, dann wählt Gotti. Wenn es ein glänzender Staatsmann sein soll, ist Aldo Brandini der Richtige. Wenn ihr nichts weiter sucht als einen redlichen Mann, dann wählt mich.
The good-natured eccentric Lambertini is not an obvious choice, yet he is elected Pope. As Pope Benedict XIV, the former inquisitor, increases the Vatican's leverage with the political powers of the day. His name stands for renewal and joie de vivre, and is commemorated in the Fontana di Trevi fountain, Rome's symbol-laden new landmark.
Novelty, change, was frequently identified with heresy, particularly in the area of doctrine. Benedict was, as far as I know, the only pope of the 18th century who declared, "We are not opposed to change in itself." He was the only pope of the 18th century who was so amusing that an entire book has been written about his sense of humor. He was also a pope who found it intensely difficult to be pope, and spent a great deal of time complaining about the difficulty of his cardinals. And he had, it may be said, terrible problems with his cardinals.
Lambertini proves to be a powerful and headstrong pontiff. The cardinals' expectations are disappointed. They would have preferred a weak pope who wouldn't have interfered with the plans of the powerful. They are particularly upset by Lambertini's fondness for the style of the godless philosopher of the Enlightenment, Voltaire.
Voltaire had early dealings with the Pope, and they were highly amusing. When he published his play on Muhammad, in short, about the central figure of the Islamic religion, it was burnt by the prefect of police in Paris as heretical and depraved. Voltaire, being Voltaire, then thought of dedicating it to the Pope. And Benedict, being Benedict with a sense of humor, accepted the dedication
Benedict accepted Voltaire's dedication of his piece Mahomet. He once wrote about Voltaire in a letter, "We should never have lost him."
E lui in una lettera ha un'espressione su Voltaire, dice: noi non avremmo dovuto perderlo.
The Pope wants to win over the free thinker Voltaire, of all people, to the Church, even though Voltaire had advocated religious tolerance in his work Maometto. In the eyes of the Inquisition, this is a ruinous idea that mocks the Church's claim to possession of the sole valid truth. The secret files reveal that Voltaire, for his part, soon hopes for even more from the Pope.
But this wasn't enough for Voltaire, who demanded 2 silver medals from the Pope with Benedict's image upon them, and wrote a letter in perfect diplomatic form, which is now to be found in the Vatican archives. It's a letter of great interest for the history of this alleged enemy of the Catholic religion and this bitter despiser of the papacy, because the last sentence of the letter reads in the correct Kurial form, "I kiss your holy foot."
Und der Papst hat natürlich diesen heuchlerischen Brief zum Anlass genommen, um diesen Gottlosen doppelt zu geißeln.
Mein lieber Freund, man merkt, dass ihr noch neu seid am heiligen Offizium. Durch den Heiligen Vater, lang möge er leben, haben sich viele Dinge geändert.
Aber das kann doch diesen Voltaire nicht vor dem Zorn des Heiligen Offiziums schützen. Man nennt ihn ja den Papst der Gottlosigkeit.
Es gibt auch voreilige Zungen, die nennen unseren Heiligen Vater Papa Protestante.
Der Papst ist Lutheraner. So, das ist nicht zum Scherzen.
Ich habe entschieden, was ich Monsieur Voltaire zu antworten gedenke. Zum Zeichen meiner Wertschätzung werde ich ihm 2 Medaillons mit meinem Porträt übersenden.
Heiliger Vater, dadurch wird der Heilige Stuhl vor aller Welt bloßgestellt, wenn ich dieser Aufrührer irre zu leiten vermag.
Bruder Lorenzo, es ist eine Sache, das Genie eines Voltaire zu ehren, was ich tue. Die andere wäre es, einen unsinnigen Dogmen anzuhängen. Oder wollt ihr behaupten, dass ich der Papst ein Ketzer bin?
The Franciscan monk Lorenzo Ganganelli, also known as Fra Lorenzo, acts as a consultant to the Inquisition. The ambitious monk wants to climb the ranks of the Roman Church. But at the top of the hierarchy, there is a pope who is obviously making common cause with some of the most seditious elements against the Church. It was unthinkable to attack the pope directly. In the archives of the Inquisition, we can find reports by the young book censor, Ganganelli. Voltaire, the Pope's favorite author, becomes the target of his rabid reports.
Scandalous, impious, erroneous, stinking of heresy, and, worst of all, insulting the Roman Inquisition. The censor, who is Ganganelli, writes at the beginning of this censorship a long series of reflections on the subject of censorship, basically saying what an excellent practice it was in antiquity that books were burnt. And this is the solution which he would dearly like to see adopted in the case of Voltaire. And if you read carefully the censorship written by Ganganelli over Voltaire, it is a critique of the reform program of the Pope. In short, in the mirror of censorship, you can see reflected the power struggles within the institution. And one of the important points to be made here is this is an example, but it's only one of many examples, of the Holy Office, which has as its nominal head the Pope, opposing the policy of its head and thwarting his reforms.
For centuries, judgment has been passed on heretics in the main church of the Roman Inquisition, Santa Maria sopra Minerva. Now, the most incredible rumor spreads among the inquisitors here. The Pope plans to blunt the Church's most effective weapons, the Holy Office and the Index of Prohibited Books. The Pope wants to have the verdicts against such men as Copernicus and Galileo reviewed. He even wants the Inquisition to protect Catholic authors from arbitrary censorship. This and much more is contained in the papal bull, Solicita et Provida, one of the most sensational decrees ever issued by a pope.
Benedict XIV's demands were very clear. The author has to be heard, his work studied carefully, and legal counsel provided to him. Benedict XIV had these demands implemented by the Inquisition. That was his great innovation. That was true modernity.
E novità, veramente modernità, nel senso della modernità.
Wenn denn der Heilige Vater es so will, dass Galilei und Kopernikus vom Index der verbotenen Bücher verschwinden, so...
Ihr alle wisst wie ich, worum es geht. Galilei, Kopernikus. Nein! Die Heilige Inquisition hat es sich damals nicht leicht gemacht. Wie können wir jetzt den Vätern in den Rücken fallen? Manche von ihnen stehen im Ruch der Heiligkeit.
Die Zeiten ändern sich. Der Heilige Vater...
Unser Jahrhundert ist degeneriert. Die Moral ist auf dem Tiefstand. Verbotene Bücher kann ich bei jedem Buchhändler wie selbstverständlich in den Auslagen finden. Dieses Treiben wollt ihr wohl noch legalisieren.
In welcher Zeit lebt ihr eigentlich, Bruder Lorenzo? Begreift ihr nicht, dass das heilige Offizium nur noch als Zielscheibe des Spottes von Kindern taugt? Jedes Buch, das wir verbieten, wird auf dem Markt ein schier unbegreiflicher Erfolg. Eben weil wir es verboten haben.
Ich verlange doch nicht Scheiterhaufen und brennende Bücher, Heiliger Vater. Ich verlange nur, dass die Kirche dort Nein sagt, wo sie Nein sagen muss.
Weißt du es besser? Dann sei du Papst!
Heiliger Vater, ihr seid unser einziges Licht.
Erzählen wir doch nichts. Wenn ich meinen Kardinälen etwas befehle, gehorchen sie nicht. Bitte ich meine Bischöfe, tun sie geradewegs das Gegenteil. Und das Volk, mir noch am liebsten, tut sowieso, was es will.
The Pope's opponents are not ready to admit defeat. They place their bets on means that are time-tested in Rome, intrigue and forgetfulness. Benedict XIV's plans are divulged prematurely. The reports, written on works which the Pope's opponents hope to have banned in order to thwart his aims, eventually become longer than the works themselves. The bold reform proposal is relegated to the musty depths of the archives, where it is hoped it will disintegrate to dust.
You have no coherence of policy. And the idea that these organizations, such as the Holy Office, were subordinate to the Pope is only formally true. I have found many cases in which the will of the Pope was frustrated or completely reversed by the Holy Office, which was in general very good at conducting a civil war against the papacy.
Benedict XIV, who has now been Pope for over 15 years, is approaching 80. He is plagued by gout, and he is weary. And yet his reforms have barely begun. It is a race against time. The Pope proposes the canonization of his role model, the Cardinal and Inquisitor Robert Bellarmine. He is met with brutal opposition. The Catholic powers are up in arms at the idea, for Bellarmine was a Jesuit. The Jesuits were at the time the targets of bitter hatred, expressed, among other things, in the form of malicious caricatures. In South America, they opposed the brutal conquistadors. In Europe, members of the order were alleged to have revealed to the Pope matters learned during confession, including state secrets. For Benedict XIV, the Jesuit and book censor Lazari became one of his most important supporters. The matter at hand was the unfinished case of Galileo.
And Lazari wrote a long memorandum advocating that the ban should be relaxed. One of his chief arguments was that the ban was correct at the time that it was leveled in 1616, because Galileo had not proven his theories, but that as time had passed, these ideas had been established. This was one argument. Another argument, which I think is of great importance and of great topical relevance, is Lazari's opinion that the Inquisition and the Index were not infallible, that they could make mistakes.
The Inquisition comes to an absurd compromise. It will admit that the earth revolves around the sun, but continues to prohibit Galileo's writings, even though they assert exactly that.
The problem of Galileo is linked to the deeper and much more controversial problem of the authority of the Holy Office, the authority of the Congregation of the Index, and naturally with them of the papacy, and the acknowledgement of the possibility of error on the part of these organizations is something that for many members of the Inquisition and Index was intolerable, unthinkable in the 18th century.
In the view of the Inquisitors, Galileo must remain banned for all eternity. For if the Inquisition admits to past mistakes, doubts will taint any future judgments it might make. This problem remains today. It is still difficult for the Church to admit publicly to the sins and mistakes of the past.
Wir sollten deswegen nicht einfach verstummen und sagen, ja, wir haben ja mehrfach.
There is no reason for us to fall silent, to think we were wrong several times in the history of the Church, so we better not say anything now. Then we wouldn't be doing our part, doing what history rightly expects of us. It is important to have the humility to realize that in such cases, final decisions are often a long time in the making, and that first decisions can be flawed.
Die ist für uns schon sehr wichtig.
Benedict's reform of the Inquisition comes at once too early and too late. The daily battles have worn the Pope out, but worst of all is his realization that he cannot trust anyone.
Heiliger Vater, ich erbitte nur noch diese Kleinigkeit.
Warum soll sich mein Nachfolger kümmern?
Eine Unterschrift. Nur eine Formalität.
Er soll Lorenzo Ganganelli zum Purpur der Kardinäle erheben. Dies soll mein Vermächtnis sein.
Heiliger Vater, das ist ein Ausdruck unserer Ratlosigkeit. Für den Fall, dass ihr nicht mehr seid.
Und heuchle doch nicht. Ich weiß doch selber, dass es euch allen schon viel zu lange mit mir gedauert hat.
Benedict XIV dies at a ripe old age. The Inquisition makes sure that his legacy remains without effect. Ganganelli, an inquisitor of the old school, soon becomes cardinal. No one is there to slow his rapid ascent to the top of the church hierarchy. The Jesuits loyal to the Pope are driven out of half of Europe. The Curia is forced to stand by helplessly. 11 years after Lambertini's death, the papacy is in the throes of its worst crisis since the days of the Reformation. It is caught between the political powers of the day and anti-clerical reformers. And again, it is time for a Pope to be elected.
Und geben wir nicht Acht, werden wir trotz unseres Alters noch erleben, dass unsere heilige Kirche in Ruinen versinkt.
Nun, er wird dafür sorgen, dass dies nicht geschieht.
Niemandem war es so in die Hand gegeben.
Ja, niemand zuvor hätte je so viel Gutes hervorbringen können, als er in den heutigen Zeitläufen.
Und niemand so viel Schlechtes. Möge der Herr euch die Stärke geben, die Mutter Kirche durch die Untiefen der Zeit zu führen, Heiliger Vater.
Möge der Herr euch ein langes Leben gewähren, Heiliger Vater.
So sei es.
Fra Lorenzo Ganganelli becomes Pope Clement XIV. It is hoped that the relentless inquisitor will restore the Church to its former position of power and stop the godless innovators.
He is a man who defends the traditional methods of the Holy Office. He is a man who is very different from Benedict in one central political and intellectual sphere, and that is the reaction to the Enlightenment. Ganganelli sees the Enlightenment as a threat. He wants it to be stopped.
But the Church only has real power over its most loyal followers. In 1773, the increasingly weak Ganganelli submits to pressure from the political powers and bans the Jesuit order. For the persecution of the Jesuits who are loyal to him, Ganganelli repeals regulations that had remained valid even during the most terrible phases of the Inquisition. There are no longer even any investigations, trials, or verdicts. Instead, Jesuits are imprisoned for indefinite periods of time without the right to a hearing or legal counsel. Members of the order's upper echelon are thrown into the dungeons of Castel Sant'Angelo, where they starve or freeze to death.
It's easy for us to judge a century when people lived in a completely different context. But history puts many things into perspective, and from the context of our time, things look different, and we shouldn't be so quick with our judgments. But there are also many things that can never be right, and that can never become right, even with historical perspective.
Merciless as inquisitor, cowardly and weak as pope. Thus one could sum up the life of Lorenzo Ganganelli, Pope Clement XIV. After having persecuted not only his enemies, but also his supporters, Ganganelli increasingly suffers from delusions and paranoia. He is convinced that the Jesuits are bent on revenge, even from their prison cells.
Was ist heute für ein Tag?
Der 21. September, Heiliger Vater.
Der 21. September. Morgen ist der 22. September. Auf den Tag genau vor einem Jahr habe ich die verfluchten Oberen der Jesuiten in die Engelsburg sperren lassen. Sie wollen mich vergiften. Sie wollen Rache nehmen.
A day later, the Pope is dead. Vicious rumors spread like wildfire. An international commission of physicians examines the body for traces of poison. It finds none. But peace is not restored. Ganganelli's body decomposes unnaturally fast. Some see this as proof that he was poisoned. Others see it as a divine warning. It is extremely difficult to find someone willing to hold his eulogy. Ganganelli leaves behind a church that is weaker than ever. The Church and the Inquisition, however, will not remain this powerless. Efforts to bring about reform continue in a time of dramatic upheaval. The time is ours, the present.